My name is Megan Martires, and I co-lead the National Low Income Housing Coalition, or NLIHC's Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition. So thank you so much for letting me come talk to you today about our disaster advocacy toolkit. So to kick us off, I'm going to talk a little bit about NLIHC and our Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition. So, NLIHC is a national nonprofit who is dedicated to achieving racially and socially equitable public policy that ensures people with the lowest incomes have quality homes that are accessible, affordable, and in communities of their choice. And in doing this work, kind of like your answers just demonstrated, we saw firsthand that all of the quote unquote normal, although we know it's not very normal, issues, housing issues that we work on in our day-to-day work get about 10 times worse when a disaster hits. And so, as part of this work, we also convene the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition, or the DHRC. So, we are a group of 900 local, state, and national organizations, including, we say many, but honestly, if not all, who have firsthand experience recovering after disasters. And we work to ensure that federal disaster recovery efforts reach all impacted households, including those with the lowest income and from the most marginalized groups, who I'm sure I don't have to tell you all are often the hardest hit by disasters, but have the fewest resources to recover. So, in short, we do traditional legislative advocacy, education and info sharing within our coalition, technical assistance, kind of like what we're doing today, and coalition building, including connecting organizations doing really similar work. And all of our work runs out of a working group that we hold every other Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern. It is open to all, but please consider this your official invitation to join us. I will drop the link when I'm done yapping. Cool. So before we jump into the meat of the presentation, I very briefly just wanted to share my own story to introduce myself and ground us in all that we're going to be talking about today. So, Dana, if we could go to the next slide. The first picture I have up here is a picture of Manville, New Jersey. And this area is largely considered to be ground zero for Hurricane Ida in the state. So my childhood home is about 15 minutes from where this picture was taken. Many of the communities I grew up in were deeply impacted, and what my family most vividly recalls from the night Hurricane Ida hit was the sound of water rushing, like rushing into the sides of our house. And to make a long story short, I ended up getting connected with an amazing group of Superstorm Sandy survivors who were getting drawn into Hurricane Ida recovery because of all their hard-earned knowledge and expertise. And they asked me if I would lead their IDA campaign. So I worked as a community organizer in New Jersey, where I built, organized, and mobilized a base of more than 1,000 people impacted by IDA to advocate for solutions to fix our broken disaster recovery system. So before coming to the DHRC and having the privilege to co-lead it, I was a member. And I initially got connected because, as I learned is far from uncommon, the survivors I was organizing with couldn't access FEMA rental assistance. And it took relationships with a network of folks around the country who were experienced with this and their additional capacity to ID where issues were coming from, figure out the person who could solve it, and craft resources to aid in our overall advocacy campaign to put us on the path to solve this issue. And that network was the DHRC. So I'll leave it there for now, but today I hope I can pay it forward and hopefully do the same for y'all. So the first thing Andy and Dana asked me to talk about is, why did we create this toolkit? And I think to do that, we first have to quickly discuss two things. So what is a disaster and the broken disaster recovery system? So generally, a disaster is defined as when a hazard, be it wind, rain, Godzilla, God knows, meets the built environment, the places where we live and work and go about our lives, and causes conditions that overwhelm our ability to effectively withstand and respond to it while continuing to function. The vast majority of recovery and mitigation programs come from the federal government, the two largest being FEMA and HUD's long-term recovery program. I mention this because not all places that experience a disaster get access to those resources. The key to unlocking those critical programs and resources is getting the federal government to designate your disaster impacted area as a presidentially declared disaster. So the federal government will issue a presidentially declared disaster when a state, territory, or tribe's ability to respond is overwhelmed and that place has reached a certain threshold of damage. So I wanted to go through this just very briefly to emphasize that, of course, while disasters are nonpartisan, meaning they impact us all, they are very much political in that one, they hit those with the least resources particularly hard. And two, there are systems in place that if we do not understand and take action around, we will not get our communities fully recovered, much less better prepared for the next disaster. So this reality is really made all the more important to understand because we're recovering in a fundamentally broken disaster recovery system. If I could get the next slide, Dana. So when a disaster occurs, many of us struggle to recover for years because the resources we need in order to do that simply aren't enough, or they aren't even there in the first place. And as a result, we experience what we call the disaster after the disaster, the long-lasting financial, emotional, and health impacts of a system that leaves families to fall through the cracks. So disaster advocacy, the DHRC, NSIDER, you all here exist because this process doesn't work. Because our disaster recovery system is broken, our solution is not any one program, service, or simple answer. Because if we're being honest, those aren't usually very good at getting people fully recovered. Our solution is instead to fight to create something that doesn't yet exist, which is a system that puts people first, gets them home and whole, and does it right the first time and every time. And that is why we do what we do, which is organize our communities, build power together, and take those demands to the places it needs to go to make it happen. And because we are recovering in a broken system, there are points throughout the recovery process, no matter the type of disaster, how big it is, or where it happens, where we know survivors are going to fall through the gaps. And that's where this advocacy to redress harms and build a new system really begins in earnest. So, with that in mind, the toolkit has four basic goals. When you're a state or local organization in a disaster impacted area, your time and capacity are arguably the most valuable resource you have, and you cannot afford to waste either. So, this toolkit is an effort to help organizations preserve that time and capacity by not having to start from scratch, weighing in when your efforts will have the most impact, those points in the process where we know survivors will fall through the cracks, and quickly and simply explaining what, in my opinion, is purposefully designed to be a very confusing process. So, this toolkit was aimed at community organizations of all types who are in areas that have experienced disasters. And when I say all kinds, I mean all kinds from like faith-based organizations, legal aid, case management, housing advocates, for better or worse, like our experiences and our conversation before demonstrated, disasters make advocates of us all. So in my experience, it's usually around the time survivors get their first FEMA denial letter that community organizations begin to realize just what a broken system we have and advocacy really begins. Ideally, obviously, it should begin before that. But my point is, if you're a community organization of any kind, this toolkit is for you. So the toolkit has three sections based on the phases of disaster recovery: short-term recovery, long-term recovery, and mitigation and resilience. And just to make sure we're all on the same page, I'm going to briefly explain each of those phases. So, short term recovery happens in the first couple of months following the disaster. The main source of assistance during this phase is FEMA, and the recovery is focused on getting survivors temporary housing, rental assistance, and doing some repairs to homes and critical infrastructure. Long-term recovery happens in the years following disaster, and assistance mainly comes from HUD's long-term recovery program, depending on if and when Congress funds it, which is a fun story for another day. During this phase, assistance is focused on addressing unmet needs survivors still have, building housing and infrastructure, economic development, large-scale mitigation projects, and much more. And finally, mitigation and resilience. So, mitigation and resilience activities happen throughout the disaster recovery process, but ideally should be done before disaster occurs. Unfortunately, again, because we're in a broken system, that is rarely the case. So, most of FEMA and HUD's mitigation and resilience programs are triggered to begin after a disaster has already happened. Mitigation and resilience activities can be things like weatherization, hardening housing and other buildings, elevation, optional buyouts, and more. So we can do the next slide. Each section identifies about 5 to 6 issues where survivors usually fall through the cracks. So these issues are ones repeatedly experienced by folks in our coalition. So remember earlier I was saying I got connected to the DHRC through the issue of FEMA rental assistance. Well, we have a section on that in the toolkit that is essentially an updated version of the resources the DHRC created for me when I was organizing. So all this to say, these issues didn't come out of nowhere. They're ones that we regularly see people experience. And generally, all issues can be boiled down to a couple key themes. First, keeping survivors in their homes and communities. So, our disaster recovery system prioritizes and protects property, not so much people. For example, following a disaster, we'll build homes, which, do not get me wrong, is good, but we make it extremely difficult for the people who have to live in those homes one day to get rental assistance while they're being rebuilt, if they get it at all. Second, survivors having a say in the recovery process. So we know survivors, those closest to the issue, are experts who have to be at the table for recovery to actually work. Unfortunately, they're not treated as such. And there are little to no requirements for them to weigh in formally throughout the recovery process. Third, addressing needs of marginalized groups. So disasters impact us all, but they hit those with the lowest incomes and from the most marginalized groups worst and first. And despite this, recovery programs hardly ever structure themselves and their assistance to account for that. And those survivors are especially left out of having a say in the recovery. And fourth and finally, assistance availability, eligibility, and timelines. So almost none of these assistance programs begin automatically. You have to advocate for every program to even start. Eligibility requirements can be very strict and in many cases prohibitive, and timelines are at best confusing and at worst prevent survivors from accessing much needed aid. I want to emphasize something I just said. Almost none of these programs even start, much less function effectively without us having to advocate for it. This alone underscores the need for advocacy throughout this process. So, to aid in that effort, the toolkit provides 3 resources for each issue: a one-page explainer of the issue, talking points, and an advocacy letter. So, personally, I think it's most helpful to talk about how to use the toolkit before the disaster, during the disaster, and after the disaster. So, let's start with before the disaster. I will just say this, which I'm, sure is going to be a theme throughout this whole workshop. No one thinks they're a disaster advocate. until suddenly you are a disaster advocate. With that being said, like, let's be honest, we are living in very challenging times where we barely have enough time and capacity to worry about what we have going on today. So I think a more realistic ask is don't worry about being an expert. Just familiarize yourself with the gaps in the system. If something were to happen, that's where you'd want to spend your time weighing in anyway. You don't have to know every single little detail. And if you want to go the extra mile, spend some time thinking about how your organization could plug in to advocate to fill those gaps in a way that aligns with your current work. And lastly, like I said, far too many of us have been impacted by disasters for anyone to have to struggle and do this alone. So feel free to connect with us, connect with Insider, build the relationship now. That's the most important thing, and do the work together when the time comes. Then during the disaster, um, is by far, I think if we can go back a slide, Dana, when the toolkit is going to be the most useful if you familiarize yourself with those gaps ahead of time. So, one pagers can be used to quickly educate and organize survivors and other partner organizations. Talking points can be used for press to shape the narrative around the disasters and emphasize that we survivors are not victims, but experts with solutions. They can also be used for meetings with governments, agencies, elected officials, etc. And letters can be sent to those same governments, agencies, elected officials as one tool in your larger advocacy campaign. And finally, after the disaster, by far the best time to focus on mitigation and resilience is before a disaster ever happens. So, this is something we should be pushing for every day of every week and often aligns with many of the other issues we're working on, from food security to safe housing to child welfare. And I'm happy to talk more about that alignment with folks outside of the workshop. I'd also ask that you share your feedback with us on the toolkit. So things are constantly changing as it pertains to disaster. So reach out and let us know if things need to be edited, added, or removed. Okay, now next slide. So there are also moments in the recovery process where this toolkit is not the best tool you have in your toolbox. And there are two major ones that come to mind for me. So the toolkit is not going to be helpful during the emergency response phase of the disaster. So the emergency response phase is the days to weeks following a disaster when the focus is emergency response. So addressing basic needs like food, water, shelter, restoring power, and just ensuring people have a basic level of safety. Not going to be helpful to send a letter then. It's also not going to be helpful if you're an individual survivor trying to fulfill super immediate needs and you're in need of services. Um, so, for example, the Smith family needs a new roof. Liz needs $1,000 for next month's rent. Marcus is having title documentation issues. Addressing the issues and in the toolkit will obviously ultimately result in more resources for all survivors to aid in these issues, but it doesn't happen overnight. And this toolkit was not designed to aid individual survivors and help them advocate for their individual cases. That would be a different set of tools.
Are going to ask you a couple of questions here. Use the chat if you would. You had the toolkit in advance. We're sure you all studied it. And if you didn't, it's okay. You put your best answer that you have in the chat if you would. Um, Question number one. Which federal program is described in the toolkit as the primary source of long-term disaster recovery funding? Is it A, FEMA individual assistance, B, small business administration loans, C, community development block grant for disaster recovery, or D, the National Flood Insurance Program? Seeing a lot of folks saying C, a couple of folks saying A, a B in there. I'm going to go to Megan. Megan, can you give us the answer, please?
Yeah, it's C, the CDBGDR program.
This is a complicated question, right? It is intentionally a bit tricky because FEMA individual assistance does start things off, and there is a lot of conversation about how whether or not long-term recovery funding should actually be managed by FEMA after all. And in there is the Small Business Administration, because even individuals confusingly can apply for a loan from the Small Business Administration. It goes to show you just how complex this is here. Toolkit in the chat from Megan about how HUD and FEMA work together. Y'all ready for question two? Okay, it's a long one. Stay with me. If the governor or a tribal chief executive requests a major disaster declaration from the president, how long does the approval typically take? Emphasis on typically. And how long do they have to appeal if it is denied? 48 hours with 15 days to appeal, several weeks with 30 days to appeal, 6 months and 60 days to appeal, or it's an automatic trigger and there is no appeal process. Go ahead and load your answer up in the chat. And we'll go in 3, 2, 1. Hit enter. Seeing a mix of A's and B's with a D in here. Mix of A and B. Drum roll, please. Megan. The answer the answer is B. It typically takes several weeks for a presidential disaster declaration to come down. They can go faster. Some of them can take a lot longer and require appeals as well. And that is why Megan has said that even just asking for funds to flow from the federal government, that itself is a point of advocacy.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. I think I might have been delayed. The answer is B. Sorry.
We are going to a North Carolina example straight from the toolkit. After Hurricane Florence, some North Carolina homeowners faced barriers because they lacked traditional title documentation for their homes. What broader lesson does the example teach advocates? And I should add in there, because I wrote the question wrong, they faced barriers, and that Legal Aid of North Carolina represented several homeowners and clients in the program, and they won a change to the rules. So what is the answer here? A, federal rules can never be changed. B, eligibility requirements are always set by HUD. C, state and local program rules matter and can often be changed through advocacy. Or D, heirs property is an illegal form of property ownership. Lots of folks coming in with C. Megan, give us the background.
C. All rules are the rules until they are changed.
That if we are ever just told by state government employees that there's nothing we can do about it, there's typically something that we can do about it. And we as advocates need to be clear who has the power to do something about it. Is it HUD that needs to be dealt with? Is it our state government? Is it local implementers? For time, we are going to skip ahead to question number 6. Good news, everybody. A disaster recovery policy change has been announced at the federal level. Advocates did everything that they could and they won. Hooray. So, what should they do next? A, celebrate the win and move on to other issues. B, wait for the government agencies to report their results. C, monitor implementation and build relationships with those carrying out the form. Or D, focus only on the future legislation because the last bottle is won. Yeah, not a surprise for a group of advocates. It's C, that even when changes happen, the toolkit tells us disaster advocacy happens 360 days a year. We get 5 days off, but the other 360, we are working on this work. Last question for the group. Take a second and reflect for yourself about your own organization here. Which stage of disaster advocacy is your organization strongest in? These are all critical parts of the advocacy cycle, and that long-term accountability piece is one that makes sure that decision makers and policymakers know that that they will always have somebody looking. Megan, what would you say as well from your experience as an organizer here?
I echo what you said, which is you need all. Um, and I think once you start seeing the challenges, it becomes, especially in the disaster advocacy context, it becomes very hard not to go to B, C, and D, um, because you see the gaps in the system intimately. And so I would encourage those who said A in the chat to, that is fantastic and great, but like I would say you have a unique knowledge and understanding that those in power who can make broader changes to the system need to hear, because they don't have that unique insight, and knowledge. Um, I'll also say that doing all of these different pieces, the key to making it easier and more accessible and not feel daunting and overwhelming is building relationships with other people doing this work or going through similar things. We can't all do everything, but if we spend the time building the relationships before the disaster happens, it becomes much, much easier to do the work when it does. And this is my favorite soapbox, but I will stop there for now.
Building the relationships makes this feel less overwhelming.
Um, we'll get going into our panel. First, I want to introduce the folks that are here today. If you could kind of raise your virtual hand so you'll pop up on people's screen. We are joined by Curtis Hill, who is from Disability Rights of North Carolina, Molly Maynard from Pisca Legal Services, and Vicki Meath from Just Economics. You should see those folks pop up on your screen. There's a nice picture of all three of them. We'll start off just a quick introduction for each, and then answer the first question, if you can, within that introduction by giving us a brief example of an advocacy campaign that you worked on following a disaster. Let us know what worked, what didn't work. And I'll ask either, let's start with Curtis. Curtis, go ahead.
All right, my name is Curtis Hill, and I'm from Eastern North Carolina, from a small town of Whiteville, and so I've experienced Hurricane Florence, Matthew, and every other hurricane in between, except um, except uh, Helene. But we were actively involved in those particular endeavors. I think one of the advocacy pieces that we were able to do, that I was able to use, I run a small nonprofit as well down in the eastern part of the state. And we were advocating for supplies for folks, to make sure people had access to the actual supplies and community during disasters happen. and we were successfully able to do that. And then Disability Rights North Carolina, when I was working there, we were also able to advocate for access during one of the real bad tornadoes that happened in Bertie County to make sure folks were able to get the resources that they needed on the ground during COVID. So, and also another advocacy piece for me, I think we were also able to advocate for a better recovery process for the state of North Carolina. I think that's one of the major pieces that we're able to advocate for to make sure that people understand some of the limitations with people with disabilities and how does that show up in your planning of your programs and implementations and thinking about the long-term ways that we implement programs that have the better impact, not only for people with disabilities, but we believe if you have it in plain language and things like that, it helps everybody understand the programs that they're in. So it's those kind of learning tools that we've been able to use to really transform the recovery system in North Carolina. It's still got a ways to go, but I think it's a lot better than when I started here.
Sure. Really touching in on that consistency, persistency, long-term advocacy in Eastern North Carolina. Let's go Molly and then Vicky.
I'm Molly Maynard. I am an attorney at Pisgah Legal Services in Western North Carolina. I'm based out of our Asheville office. And so everybody on our staff was directly impacted by Helene, but an advocacy effort that we started within about a week was doing FEMA clinics throughout the region that was impacted and bringing in people to help with their initial applications, which then turned into helping with appeals and helping with, I mean, we're still helping with FEMA issues for individuals, but also advocating for, broader and more person-friendly interpretation of the rules that might create barriers to people getting access to things like assistance to rebuild homes and other through a variety of programs, initially FEMA and then all the ones that have followed.
Yeah. Providing that legal advocacy for the appeals process that will inevitably come when applying for FEMA assistance. Vicky, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. I'm Vicky Meath with Just Economics based in Asheville, Western North Carolina, and big fan of the National Low Income Housing Coalition and Insider, who are extremely helpful to me personally and to our organization and the region. One advocacy campaign that we worked on was an eviction foreclosure moratorium. And while that was not successful, we did have successes come out of that and learned a lot of things come out of that. One is that also bled into our work on getting a temporary eviction pause and rent reduction to zero for public housing residents, and that was successful. Additionally, our work in working on an eviction and foreclosure moratorium helped to uplift the need for rental assistance and support for homeowners and renters, so many that were struggling in Buncombe County.
So highlighting that advocacy can also uplift other issues that people experience. Thanks for that introduction. The second question, and I just open up to either all three of you if you feel moved to answer this one, is so since we're launching the toolkit today, looking back, how would a resource like this have changed your approach or your workload?
I can start. I think the toolkit was extremely helpful and for me, in Western North Carolina, all of us were impacted by Helene in different ways. And so I felt like my brain was a little broken post Helene. And that kind of took effect for months following Helene. And so having the experiences from other communities to fall back on and know what's possible. Also, I'm an experienced advocate. We do advocacy at our organization on a local and state level. We do very little on a national level, but even the work on a state level It's disaster advocacy is a whole different animal. It follows different timelines and different rules. And so the guidance of Insider's policy coordination team and the toolkit, I recall several times being on the policy coordination team meeting and saying, we need to do this. And Megan or Noah dropping in the chat a sample letter that was just great. I don't have to start this from scratch. And so, extremely helpful in learning from the experiences, collective experiences of disaster survivors all across the country and people that have helped disaster survivors all across the country in knowing what's possible.
Yeah,
So it
I'll
sounds like,
just, oh,
sorry,
sorry, go
Molly,
ahead.
go ahead. No, Molly, go ahead.
I was gonna echo that, and particularly just the knowledge that post-disaster, you're not going to be at your best for whatever reason, whether you don't have power or you can't download things from the internet, or because your brain is just broken, as most of ours were. Uh, Having things like the timelines that you showed in the toolkit to kind of give you an idea of like, okay, we're in the first week. Here's what we need to be focused on. Here's what the community is going to need help with. And putting together, we spent a lot of time just trying to figure out what resources there were and which ones were good and who we needed to call, and having it kind of all put in one place, um, I think would have changed our efficiency in those first couple of weeks, to be able to know like this is where we're going to learn how to help people with FEMA appeals, and this is who we're going to call for this kind of help, and then this is when we're going to start transitioning to this other kind of issue and advocating for how CDBG DR funds are going to be allocated and all that kind of thing.
Yeah. Hearing that it really adds capacity and helps cut down the timelines that you're fighting against. Curtis, anything you'd like to touch on?
Yeah, I think for me the toolkit would have been a really good place since it gives you an idea of the disaster timelines, right? The disaster, what to do, when to do it, and it also explains, it give you a little precursor to understand exactly what the programs are. I think that's the hardest thing in a disaster to figure out. Well, should I apply for? I know I should apply for FEMA, but back in the day, you had to apply for FEMA and also USDA at the same time in order, not USDA, SBA, I'm sorry, SBA at the same time in order to even get CBGDR. Now they have changed that particular thing that you don't have to apply that way now. You can apply and also get, and don't apply and still get CBGDR. So being able to explain that to people in a way that they're able to understand it allows them and positions them and to make the best decisions for them, because you're making a lot of decisions at the front end that you don't know the implications of it. And then later on down the road, when you get your community development block grant award, and then they're talking about a duplication of benefits, and then they're talking about we're going to reduce the size so you don't have the funding. So if you had this information at the beginning, you would be better positioned to make more informed decisions with your housing situation.
Yeah. Seeing a lot of head nods as you're saying that. I want to get to our last question and also potentially open it up to folks who are participating, put in the chat. Why do you think this network, the North Carolina Inclusive Disaster Recovery Network, should be using advocacy as one of our strategies?
I think the advocacy is an important component of what we're doing, right? Because disasters, it impacts every phase of someone's life, right? Normally, when we advocate, we just advocate for a housing issue or economic issue or transportation issue. But when disaster happens, or an environmental issue, but when the disaster happens, it affects every phase of your life. And the only way to really advocate for, or to position your community in a better position is to have ongoing advocacy about it continuously, because you don't want to be trying to figure it out on the fly. You really need to establish relationships in community beforehand to understand at your local level to make sure they've got real, it's easy to say I've got an emergency management plan, but if I've never tried to implement it and don't understand the real gaps in it, then we figure out some real major problems. That's why it's important for the community to be present at meetings, when they're making these plans and challenging folks to think outside the box, because nobody would have ever thought that Helene would have happened in Western North Carolina. Now, where I live at, we think that would happen. But as we all know, you never know where disaster is going to happen in your community. That's why it's important for us to always be prepared.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Touches everyone everywhere. Yeah, Vicky.
I would just add that, having a collective, a coalition, a network to have experiences off of. So many of us, my organization doesn't typically do direct service and case management. Right after Helene, we were doing direct service and case management type activities. And so we are seeing what individuals need on the ground, and we are seeing, just like Megan talked about in her presentation, that the system is broken. And for every individual that we see, we know there are many, many that we don't see that are dealing with the same problem. And so, in order to affect the largest number of people, we need to share our collective experiences, see where there are patterns of problems, and advocate together for the solutions so that they can come about on a larger scale and at the speed that recovery needs to take, instead of kind of one by one when you're dealing with so many disaster survivors. We it's overwhelming to deal with these problems on an individual level, when at a larger scale, while advocacy can take time, on a larger scale, it's really important that we do as best we can to fix the broken system.
Yeah. Fixing broken systems on a large scale. Molly, anything to add?
I'll just add that I think the kind of the crossover of the local knowledge of how is this impacting your community specifically and differently from other places, being able to have groups like the National Low Income Housing Group to raise that up, and but also to help us not be so focused on what is happening right now at this moment of the disaster in our community that we miss the chance to advocate for better implementation of the next phase, because by the time we're seeing on the ground how that phase is broken, we have missed a lot of our best opportunity to shape things. So having this broader advocacy lens coming from the experience of other groups, and being able to combine that with, things are a little bit different in the mountains than, well, they're a lot different in the mountains than they are in the coast. And there's just different ways that things play out. I think that crossover is really, really helpful.
Yeah.
But I'd
Dana,
like
can
to
I
add,
add? Oh, go ahead.
can I add one thing into as well. Also, it gives you an idea that your experience, your individual experience, is not just a one-off. That this is what other people are experiencing, and it also tells you you're also able to see the systemic nature through the group lens, right? Because we're able to pull from my experience in Eastern North Carolina on calls, and I could see things before you all even see it out west because I've seen it happen before, and you can understand, and you can see those pitfalls with air property issues that were going on, or how they're deciding to design the program up front, like some things that we would have never done that we thought we were able to overcome in Eastern North Carolina through Matthew and Florence. We're seeing the same thing replay itself out in Western North Carolina, and we're like, why didn't you take the best practices? You know what I'm saying? Like really challenging them in the implementation stage so that you will have a better recovery process, because that's the goal of the system. And we're trying to really, and it takes all of us, everybody's insight from the ground and the historical understanding of these programs to really overcome the barriers that people are facing. Because the recovery cycle. I mean, we're just finishing up one of our houses, last houses from Hurricane Florence and Matthew. So that tells you how long that happened, and that was this last year. So that tells you all how long this process is. And then I was in Louisiana about 2 years ago, and they were still recovering from Louisiana as well. So that lets us know that this is for the long haul. So advocacy has got to be, even when it doesn't seem like it is necessary, you need to make sure you have an advocacy going on.
Yeah.
Can I just add one thing, Dana? Do we have time? I just wanted to say that how important networks like this are um, in advocacy and why it's important for this to play a role in coordinating policy advocacy. As an organization, we only have so many resources. We're a small organization. We don't have case managers, like I said, but we work very closely with case management organizations. Like we're in deep relationship and partnership with Swannanoa Communities Together, for example. So we're hearing from them what their disaster survivor clients are dealing with. And then we don't have some of the state relationships that some of our state partners, like the NC Budget and Tax Center, do. We don't have the knowledge of what the North Carolina or the National Low Income Housing Coalition has, but they also don't have the resources to be on the ground in every disaster. And so the collective impact of bringing all of those pieces together and more. So you might be thinking, I'm not skilled in advocacy. I'm not an experienced advocate, but you can have a place in disaster advocacy in these types of networks, and all of those voices matter, and collectively is what makes that impact.
Yeah. So just to summarize kind of all of those responses and relating it to the network as a whole, what I'm hearing is coming together adds capacity to everyone, to the smaller grassroots organizations that maybe can't keep up with all of the policy changes. And really good advocacy helps get ahead of the issues that we know are eventually going to happen when the next disaster hits. And as Megan dropped in the chat, we win. Progress happens, things change, and systems change when we come together and advocate together.